Public International Law and Political Science. He is currently President of the Curatorium of the Hague Academy of International Law and Emeritus Professor at the University of Paris I, Panthéon-Sorbonne, where he served as the first Vice President. Professor Daudet is an arbitrator in the Court of Conciliation and Arbitration within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He has held a number of academic and research positions in France, Mauritius, Morocco, and Côte d'Ivoire. He was a member of the French delegation to the United Nations Conference on the International Code of Conduct on the Transfer of Technology. He has been chosen as judge ad hoc on numerous occasions and is currently sitting in the case concerning dispute over the status and use of waters of the Salala, Chile versus Bolivia, the case concerning alleged violations of sovereign rights and maritime spaces in the Caribbean Sea, Nicaragua versus Colombia, and in the two cases concerning application of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, Armenia versus Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan versus Armenia. Professor Daudet is a member of the editorial board of the Annuaire Français de Droit International and is a member of the French Society of International Law and the French branch of the International Law Association. He has published numerous books and articles in different areas of international law. I shall now invite Professor Daudet to make the solemn declaration prescribed by the statute, and I would request all those present to rise. Professor Daudet, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je déclare solennellement que je remplirai mes devoirs et exercerai mes attributions de juge en tout honneur et dévouement, en pleine et parfaite impartialité et en toute conscience.
I thank Professor Daudet. Please be seated. I take note of the solemn declaration made by Judge Ad hoc Daudet and declare him duly installed as Judge Ad hoc in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. I shall now recall the principal steps of procedure in the present case. On 26 February 2022, Ukraine filed in the Registry of the Court an application instituting proceedings against the Russian Federation concerning, I quote, a dispute relating to the interpretation, application, and fulfillment of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, end of quote. I shall refer to this convention as the Genocide Convention. To found the jurisdiction of the court, Ukraine invokes Article 36, Paragraph 1 of the Statute of the Court and Article 9 of the Geneva Convention. In its application, Ukraine contends inter alia, and I quote, the Russian Federation has falsely claimed that acts of genocide have occurred in the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine, and on that basis recognized the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, and then declared and implemented a special military operation against Ukraine with the express purpose of preventing and punishing purported acts of genocide that have no basis in fact. On the basis of this false allegation, Russia is now engaged in a military invasion of Ukraine involving grave and widespread violations of the human rights of Ukrainian people. End of quote. Ukraine denies that any such genocide has occurred and states that it submitted the application, I quote, to establish that Russia has no lawful basis to take action in and against Ukraine for the purpose of preventing and punishing any purported genocide, end of quote. In its application, Ukraine also accuses the Russian Federation of carrying out the actus reus of genocide by intentionally killing and inflicting serious injury on Ukrainian nationals, accompanied by what Ukraine considers rhetoric suggestive of genocidal intent. Together with its application, Ukraine also submitted a request for the indication of provisional measures, referring to Article 41 of the statute and Articles 73, 74, and 75 of the Rules of Court. According to Ukraine, the purpose of its request is to, I quote, prevent irreparable prejudice to the rights of Ukraine and its peoples, and avoid aggravating or extending the dispute between the parties under the Genocide Convention." End of quote. The registrar will now read out the passage from the request specifying the provisional measures which the government of Ukraine is asking the court to indicate. You have the floor, Mr. Registrar.
Thank you, Madam President. I quote, "Ukraine respectfully requests that the court indicate the following provisional measures. A. The Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations commenced on 24 February 2022 that have as their stated purpose and objective the prevention and punishment of a claimed genocide in the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine. B. The Russian Federation shall immediately ensure that any military or irregular armed units which may be directed or supported by it, as well as any organizations and persons which may be subject to its control, direction and influence, take no steps in furtherance of the military operation which have as their stated purpose and objective preventing or punishing Ukraine for committing genocide. C. The Russian Federation shall refrain from any action and shall provide assurances that no action is taken that may aggravate or extend the dispute that is the subject of this application or render this dispute more difficult to resolve. D. The Russian Federation shall provide a report to the court on measures taken to implement the court's order on provisional measures 1 week after such order, and then on a regular basis to be fixed by the court." End of quote. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the registrar. As already mentioned, immediately after the application and the request for indication of provisional measures were filed, the registrar transmitted certified copies thereof to the government of the Russian Federation. He also notified the Secretary General of the United Nations. According to paragraph 74, Article 74, paragraph 1 of the Rules of Court, a request for the indication of provisional measures shall have priority over all other cases. Paragraph 2 of the same provision states that the court shall proceed to a decision on the request as a matter of urgency. As previously noted, this imperative must be balanced with the need to fix the date of oral proceedings in such a way as to afford the parties an opportunity to be represented at the hearings. Consequently, the parties were informed that the date for the opening of the oral proceedings, during which they could present their observations on the request for indication of provisional measures, had been fixed for Monday, 7 March 2022 at 10 a.m. I would now like to welcome the delegation of Ukraine. The agent of Ukraine is present in the Great Hall of Justice. The agent is accompanied by members of Ukraine's delegation, some of whom are physically present in the Great Hall of Justice, while others are participating in the hearings remotely. For purposes of this single round of oral argument, Ukraine has available to it a 3-hour sitting. In this sitting, Ukraine may, if required, avail itself of a short extension beyond 1 p.m. today, in view of the time taken up by these introductory remarks. Before giving the floor to the agent of Ukraine, I wish to draw the attention of the applicant to Practice Direction 11, which states as follows. In the oral proceedings on request for the indication of provisional measures, parties shall limit themselves to what is relevant to the criteria for the indication of provisional measures as stipulated in the statute, rules, and jurisprudence of the court. They should not enter into the merits of the case beyond what is strictly necessary for that purpose. I now give the floor to the agent of Ukraine, Mr. Anton Kornievich. You have the floor, sir.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, it is a great honor to appear before you as the agent of Ukraine. It is also a solemn responsibility. We are here today in this building called the Peace Palace, but at home my country faces a war of aggression. I am standing here in a room called the Great Hall of Justice, but at home my countrymen see only the injustice of Russia's bombs and missiles falling on our cities and neighborhoods. As I stand before the court, Ukrainians are under deadly attacks. Millions of people are in imminent danger. The United Nations top human rights officials warns that there are significant civilian casualties. Russia's assault on Ukraine has prompted over 1.5 million people to flee the country. Many more are internally displaced. More than 15,000 people, most of them women and children, have taken shelter in Kyiv's subway tunnels. Babies are born underground there in tunnels, and hospitals are being shelled. All of this is a dire reality the people of Ukraine face now. I serve as President Volodymyr Zelensky envoy to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, but the war is preventing me from doing my job. We can no longer provide state services to our citizens who reside in occupied territory, including the administrative services, education, medical services, for instance, COVID vaccinations with internationally recognized vaccines. This is, of course, not the first time that Ukraine has experienced first-hand Russia's disrespect for international law. Now the world understands the depth of its disrespect and the hate of its cruelty. The fact that Russia's seats are empty speaks loudly. They are not here in this court of law. They are on a battlefield, waging aggressive war against my country. This is how Russia solves disputes. But Ukraine had another position and respects international law and this court of law. But even still, Russia knows that international law matters. Why else would Russia try to justify its aggression? This war, Russia says, is to stop a genocide. I quote Russia's president from the morning he ordered the invasion of Ukraine. He said, quote, "We had to stop that atrocity, that genocide," end of quote. The purpose of the war, he said, was to protect people from genocide. This is a horrible lie. Putin lies, and Ukrainians, our citizens, die. It is not Ukraine who commits genocide. It is Russia and its political leadership and military personnel who commit crimes against humanity and war crimes on the territory of Ukraine. Over the past 2 weeks, I have heard many people mention World War II. Russia sullies the memory of the Holocaust by claiming to denazify Ukraine from its democratic government. I have heard others note that Europe has not seen such aggression and conflict since World War II. It is indeed appropriate to recall World War II, but for different reasons. We should recall that in World War II, Ukrainians and Russians fought together and died together to stop evil. We should recall that on the ashes of Europe after the Second World War, the world built the modern pillars of international law. 2 of these pillars stand as the most important. The world witnessed aggression, and it answered with the Charter of the United Nations. The world witnessed the Holocaust, and it answered with a convention to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. The world said never again to the twin evils of Nazism, aggression and genocide. Unfortunately, today, Russia has perverted those words. It does not treat the duty to prevent and punish genocide as a sacred obligation. It treats it as a weapon. With its false claim of genocide, Russia uses one pillar of modern international legal order to destroy the other. By falsely claiming genocide to justify its crime of aggression and acts of aggression, Russia has defiled the Genocide Convention. Madam President, distinguished members of the court, Ukraine's case is straightforward. Russia accuses Ukraine of committing genocide. Ukraine denies that claim in the strongest possible terms, and we will prove it. Russia claims that in order to stop a non-existent genocide, it can invade a sovereign state, Ukraine. Ukraine rejects this baseless claim. My message to Russia is this. Let us settle our dispute like civilized nations. Lay down your arms and put forward your evidence. Ukraine respects this court and follows its orders. Russia must as well. But if Russia will not return to international law on its own, the court has the power to act. With respect, the court has responsibility to act. Russia consented to your jurisdiction under the Genocide Convention. Now it is abusing and violating that convention in order to kill Ukrainians and destroy Ukraine. Russia must be stopped. And the court has a role to play in stopping it. That is why the people of Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, ask you respectfully but urgently to grant our request for provisional measures. Madam President, members of the court, Ukraine's counsel here will explain why provisional measures are not only warranted, but vitally necessary. First, Professor Jean-Marc Touvenin will explain that the court has prima facie jurisdiction. Second, Mr. David Zayans will provide the factual background showing that Russia's allegations of genocide are absolutely false. Third, Ms. Marnichik will explain that the rights claimed by Ukraine in this case are at a minimum plausible, which is sufficient for provisional measures to be indicated. Fourth, Mr. Jonathan Gimblent will explain that the Ukrainian people are vulnerable in an urgent need of the court's protection. Fifth, Professor Harold Honju-Ko will explain the measures Ukraine requests and why those measures must be ordered. Finally, Ms. Oksana Zolotaryova, co-agent of Ukraine, will conclude and present Ukraine's closing statement and final submissions. On behalf of Ukraine, I thank the court for the urgency you showed in convening this hearing. I thank you, Madam President, for your urgent communication to the Russian Federation under Article 74, Paragraph 4 of the court rules. I thank the court in advance for your careful attention this morning, and I thank the court for being mindful of the extreme urgency which exists now as you deliberate. If ever there was a moment in which to exercise your power to order provisional measures, this is that moment. I now ask you to give the floor to Professor Jean-Marc Touvenin.
Thank you, Mr. Kornievich. I now invite Professor Jean-Marc Touvenin to take the floor. You have the floor, Professor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, les avocats qui paraissent devant vous aiment à vous faire savoir combien ils sont honorés de le faire. Ce n'est pas qu'une politesse, c'est une évidence, tant l'organe judiciaire principal de l'Organisation des Nations Unies, qu'est la Cour mondiale, inspire respect et confiance et donne un corps tangible à la conviction partagée par nombre de ceux qui prennent la parole à cette barre que le droit international n'est pas une vaine promesse. Aujourd'hui, le sentiment qui m'assaille, qui nous assaille tous, non seulement de ce côté-ci de la barre, mais partout en Ukraine et partout dans le monde, est celui de l'extrême urgence à entendre votre Cour prendre toute sa part dans l'action entreprise par les Nations Unies et le monde. L'extrême urgence est de faire cesser, sans délai, la guerre de prévention d'un prétendu génocide et de répression de ses prétendus auteurs lancés contre l'Ukraine, ses dirigeants contre son peuple, contre son identité, contre son existence même par le président Vladimir Poutine le 24 février 2022, sous couvert de la Convention de 1948 sur la prévention et la répression du crime de génocide. Certains diront que le 24 février 2022 marque d'une pierre noire l'histoire de la Convention de 1948. En vérité, à cette date, la Russie l'a réduite en confetti. Votre Cour, Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, peut, et je crois qu'elle doit, en rétablir l'intégrité. Elle le fera, j'en suis convaincu, mais cela prendra du temps, et du temps, nous n'en avons pas. C'est pourquoi l'Ukraine demande à votre Cour d'agir vite en indiquant les mesures conservatoires qu'elle sollicite. Vous pouvez le faire, l'Ukraine croit que vous devez le faire. Toutes les conditions sont réunies pour cela. Je démontrerai, cela vous a été annoncé, que votre compétence, qui ne doit être vérifiée que prima facie, est établie. À ma suite, Maître Zions démontrera la totale vacuité des allégations de génocide proférées par la Russie. Puis Maître Tchik montrera que les droits dont la protection est recherchée par l'Ukraine, le droit de ne pas être victime d'une interprétation et d'une implication délirante de la Convention sur le génocide, le droit de ne pas voir son territoire dévasté et sa population terrorisée au nom de la Convention sur le génocide, ces droits revendiqués par l'Ukraine sont, selon la formule consacrée, à tout le moins plausibles. Maître Gimblett vous dira que nous sommes très malheureusement bien au-delà du risque de préjudice irréparable et qu'il y a extrême urgence, le terme est vraiment pertinent ici, à éviter davantage de morts et de destruction. Enfin, le professeur Coe expliquera pourquoi les mesures provisoires demandées par l'Ukraine sont appropriées dans les circonstances extraordinaires de l'espèce et le co-agent de l'Ukraine conclura. J'en viens donc à la compétence prima facie. À cet égard, Madame la Présidente, l'Ukraine relève que la Russie a décidé de ne pas se présenter devant vous sans donner la moindre justification. Je note que dans d'autres affaires, la Russie a défendu bec et ongles que vous n'aviez pas compétence. Aussi volubiles que furent alors ces adroits avocats, ici la Russie se tait. Vous y verrez la reconnaissance par la Russie qu'elle ne saurait contester la compétence prima facie de votre Cour. L'Ukraine est également de cet avis. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, comme vous l'avez maintes fois rappelé et encore tout récemment, je cite, la Cour peut indiquer des mesures conservatoires si les dispositions invoquées par le demandeur semblent prima facie constituer une base sur laquelle sa compétence pourrait être fondée, mais elle n'a pas besoin de s'assurer de manière définitive qu'elle a compétence quant au fond de l'affaire. Fin de citation. Vos pouvoirs et compétences sont en l'espèce fondés sur l'article 36, paragraphe 1 de votre statut et sur l'article 9 de la Convention sur le génocide. Ce dernier texte est bien connu de la Cour, mais je le cite, « Les différends entre les parties contractantes relatifs à l'interprétation, l'application ou l'exécution de la présente Convention, y compris ceux relatifs à la responsabilité d'un État en matière de génocide ou de l'un quelconque des autres actes énumérés à l'article 3, seront soumis à la Cour internationale de justice à la requête d'une partie aux différends. » Fin de citation. La compétence rationnée personnée n'appelle aucun débat. La Russie et l'Ukraine sont l'une et l'autre parties à la Convention sur le génocide. Aucune n'a émis de réserve qui soit actuellement en vigueur. Pour ce qui est de la compétence rationnée matérielle, ce dont vous devez vous assurer au stade des mesures conservatoires est de l'existence prima facie d'un différend relatif à l'interprétation, l'application ou l'exécution de la Convention. Les points clés de votre jurisprudence concernant la notion de différend, rappelés dans les arrêts rendus dans les affaires des îles Marshall, peuvent être résumés comme suit. Un différend, on le sait tous, est un désaccord sur un point de droit ou de fait, une contradiction, une opposition de thèses juridiques ou d'intérêts entre des parties. Pour qu'un différend existe, il faut démontrer que la réclamation de l'une des parties se heurte à l'opposition manifeste de l'autre. Les points de vue des deux parties quant à l'exécution ou à la non-exécution de certaines obligations internationales doivent être nettement opposés. Il s'agit d'une question de fond et non de forme ou de procédure qui appelle un examen des faits. À cette fin, la Cour tient notamment compte de l'ensemble des déclarations ou documents échangés dans des enceintes multilatérales, se faisant à l'accord d'une attention particulière aux auteurs des déclarations ou documents, aux personnes auxquelles ils étaient destinés ou qui en ont effectivement eu connaissance. Le comportement des parties peut aussi entrer en ligne de compte, notamment l'absence d'échanges diplomatiques. Le désaccord ne doit en effet pas nécessairement être énoncé expressis verbis. Il est possible, comme dans d'autres domaines, d'établir par inférence quelle est en réalité la position ou l'attitude d'une partie. En particulier, la Cour a jugé que l'existence d'un différend pouvait être déduite de l'absence de réaction d'un État à une accusation dans des circonstances où une telle réaction s'imposait. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, il est évident que l'Ukraine a bien des griefs à faire valoir à l'encontre de la Russie. Pour autant, ce qui est devant vous est un différend circonscrit. Il s'agit d'un différend relatif à l'interprétation, l'application ou l'exécution de la Convention sur le génocide. Il se matérialise sous deux aspects. La première manifestation de ce différend porte sur le fait que, selon la Russie, l'Ukraine a commis un génocide dans les oblasts de Donetsk et de Louhansk. Cette accusation est au cœur de la décision du président de la Fédération de Russie du 24 février 2022. Elle est la seule justification juridique avancée par la Russie pour justifier l'attaque de l'Ukraine dans son ensemble. Cette accusation, grave, ne date pourtant pas du 24 février 2022. En fait, la Russie la profère de manière continue et de manière de plus en plus pressante depuis 8 ans, comme je vais maintenant le montrer. Avant de m'y atteler, Madame la Présidente, permettez-moi d'indiquer que tous les faits que je vais mentionner se trouvent dûment établis par des documents reproduits dans le dossier des juges, que vous pourrez consulter tout à votre aise. J'indique également que je citerai les 10 documents, dont certains sont en langue russe, dans une version française non officielle, mais que je crois fiable, afin de simplifier le travail des interprètes. Pour votre confort, une traduction en langue anglaise des documents en langue russe est également disponible dans le dossier. J'en viens donc aux faits, et en particulier aux allégations de génocide. Dès 2014, le journal Niezawissimaya Gazeta, édité à Moscou, publiait un article dont la version française édité par le magazine Courrier International, titré, je cite, « Ukraine-Russie, accusation de génocide, vers un scénario à la Kosovare ?» Son auteur soulignait que, je cite, « on entend de plus en plus résonner ce mot génocide. Fin de citation. Mais il relevait que la Russie va avoir beaucoup de mal à faire qualifier de génocide la situation dans l'est de l'Ukraine par ses homologues occidentaux. Fin de citation. Cet article de presse est contemporain de l'ouverture par le comité d'investigation de la Fédération de Russie d'une enquête sur, je cite, le génocide de la population russophone, fin de citation, vivant dans les oblasts de Louhansk et Donetsk. Le comité d'investigation de la Fédération de Russie est une agence russe officielle en charge des poursuites criminelles au niveau fédéral qui rend directement compte au président de la Fédération de Russie. Son communiqué indique que, je cite, l'enquête a permis de constater qu'au cours de la période allant du 12 avril 2014 à aujourd'hui, en violation de la Convention de 1948 pour la prévention et la répression du crime de génocide, ainsi que d'autres actes juridiques internationaux condamnant le génocide, des personnes non identifiées parmi les hauts dirigeants politiques et militaires de l'Ukraine, des forces armées de l'Ukraine, de la garde nationale de l'Ukraine et du Right Sector, je ne sais pas comment le traduire, ont donné l'ordre de détruire complètement la population spécifiquement russophone vivant sur le territoire des républiques de Donetsk et de Louhansk. En janvier 2015, de nouvelles poursuites criminelles étaient initiées par la Russie à la suite de prétendus bombardements de l'est de l'Ukraine par l'armée ukrainienne. Le comité d'investigation de la Russie affirmait que, je cite, « ces actions des militaires ukrainiens constituent des crimes spécialement graves, non seulement en vertu du droit russe, mais aussi en vertu des normes du droit international, en particulier la Convention pour la prévention et la répression du crime de génocide et d'autres textes. » Fin de citation. En février 2015, la presse mondiale, par exemple Le Soir en Belgique, relevait que le président de la Fédération de Russie, Vladimir Poutine, avait affirmé que le refus des autorités ukrainiennes de livrer du gaz aux provinces de l'Est, je cite, ressemble déjà à un génocide. Fin de citation. Le 10 septembre de la même année, un communiqué officiel du comité d'investigation de Russie annonçait engager de nouvelles poursuites contre un nombre indéfini de responsables ukrainiens, y compris le ministre de la Défense et d'autres responsables militaires nommément désignés, au motif qu'ils auraient violé, entre autres, la Convention sur la répression et la prévention, sur la prévention et la répression du génocide. Lors d'un entretien dans un média russe, Vladimir Markin, représentant officiel du parquet russe, indiquait, je cite, « Je tiens à vous rappeler que la législation russe actuelle ainsi que les normes du droit international permettent aux organes d'enquête russes de poursuivre ces personnes. Nous parlons de juridiction extraterritoriale où le principe universel s'applique. » Ce même responsable précisait que la Russie entendait exercer cette juridiction extraterritoriale dans les affaires prévues, je le cite, par les traités internationaux auxquels la Russie est partie, si les étrangers n'ont pas été poursuivis dans l'État étranger. Fin de citation. En septembre 2017, le comité d'investigation de Russie annonçait des poursuites criminelles contre 20 autres hauts responsables du ministère de la Défense de l'Ukraine, y compris à nouveau le ministre de la Défense. Selon le représentant du comité d'investigation, le même Vladimir Markin, je cite, « Les personnes mentionnées, en violation de la Convention pour la prévention et la répression du crime de génocide et d'autres actes juridiques normatifs, exerçant la direction générale des opérations militaires, ont donné sciemment des ordres criminels aux combattants des agences de sécurité ukrainiennes pour qu'ils mènent des attaques ciblées. » Fin de citation. En novembre 2021, le président de la Fédération de Russie adoptait un décret, un oukaz, en rapport avec le territoire de l'Est de l'Ukraine. L'ambassadeur de la Fédération de Russie auprès du groupe de contact pour le règlement de la situation dans l'Est de l'Ukraine, Boris Gryzlov, déclarait alors que ce décret était une réponse aux actions de Kiev qui, je cite, « relèvent en fait de la Convention des Nations Unies sur la prévention et la répression du génocide ». Fin de citation. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, ceci n'était pas un événement anodin. En effet, l'accusation de violation de la Convention des Nations Unies sur la prévention et la répression du génocide, répétée année après année par le parquet russe, venait d'être reprise et entérinée par un des plus hauts responsables de la Fédération de Russie pour ce qui concerne les relations internationales entre la Russie et l'Ukraine. L'accusation avait désormais un caractère clairement international. Elle fut d'ailleurs largement relayée par les médias officiels du pouvoir russe, qui ne s'y trompèrent pas. L'agence TASS, bien sûr, mais aussi, par exemple, RIA Novosti. D'autres médias russes, comprenant clairement le message, titraient alors « Ce que Kiev fait dans le Donbass relève de la Convention sur le génocide ». Le 9 décembre 2021, le président de la Fédération de Russie soutenait devant un journaliste de Russia Today que ce qui se passe, je cite, « Ce qui se passe actuellement dans le Donbass, vous et moi pouvons le voir, nous le savons. Cela s'appelle, bien sûr, le génocide que vous avez mentionné. » Fin de citation. L'affirmation, cette fois, du plus haut responsable de l'État russe, le président de la Fédération, fut évidemment reprise par tous les médias officiels de la Fédération, notamment l'agence TASS, mais aussi dans la presse mondiale, notamment, entre autres en France, dans Le Point. Le 10 décembre 2021, le vice-président du comité de la Douma pour les affaires internationales, Alexei Shepa, faisait savoir aux médias officiels Russia Today qu'il adhérait sans réserve aux propos du président de la Fédération de Russie. « Je suis tout à fait d'accord, dit-il. Il y a une annihilation pure et simple de son propre peuple. » Fin de citation. L'article de Russia Today, qui rend compte de ces phrases, rappelle en outre la position de l'ambassadeur Boris Gryzlov, que j'ai mentionné à l'instant, qui avait posé que ce que la Russie reproche à l'Ukraine relève en fait de la Convention des Nations Unies sur la prévention du génocide. Le 16 février 2022, durant la conférence de presse concluant une rencontre entre le président de la Fédération de Russie et le chancelier allemand Olaf Scholz, qui portait spécifiquement sur la menace d'action militaire de la Russie contre l'Ukraine, le président russe justifia d'avance une telle action en accusant l'Ukraine de génocide. Le 18 février 2022, il y a une erreur dans mon texte. Le 18 février 2022, le président du Parlement de Russie, Vyacheslav Volodine, accusa à nouveau l'Ukraine de se livrer dans l'est du pays à des actes, je cite, que des accords internationaux interdisent. Fin de citation, précisant, je cite encore, si ce n'est pas un génocide, alors qu'est-ce que c'est? Fin de citation, tout en prévenant, je cite enfin, les auteurs vont sans aucun doute être punis. Fin de citation. 3 jours plus tard, dans son discours du 21 février 2022, justifiant sa décision de reconnaître la souveraineté des prétendues républiques de Donetsk et Louhansk, le président de la Fédération de Russie accusait, je le cite, « Le monde dit civilisé dont nos collègues occidentaux se sont proclamés les seuls représentants préfère ne pas voir cela. comme si cette horreur et ce génocide, auquel près de 4 millions de personnes sont confrontées, n'existaient pas. Mais ils existent. Fin de citation. Dans son discours du 24 février 2022, reprenant une fois encore à son compte les allégations ressassées par la Russie depuis 2014, sous couvert de la Convention sur la prévention et la répression du crime de génocide, le chef de l'État russe accuse à nouveau l'Ukraine de génocide en posant que l'action militaire lancée ce funeste jour a pour, je cite, objectif de protéger les personnes qui souffrent des abus et du génocide de la part du régime de Kiev depuis 8 ans. Le 25 février 2022, l'ambassadeur de la Fédération de Russie auprès de l'Union européenne, Vladimir Chizov, confirmait dans un entretien à Euractiv que l'allégation de génocide était portée contre l'Ukraine en référence à la Convention sur le génocide. Le 28 février 2022, le ministre des Affaires étrangères de la Fédération de Russie y est revenu, accusant cette fois l'Union européenne d'avoir pris fait et cause pour, je cite, le régime de Kiev qui a mis en œuvre une politique de génocide d'une partie de sa population. Fin de citation. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, il est inutile d'accumuler davantage de preuves que ce que la Russie reproche à l'Ukraine, que ce qui a fondé sa décision de la punir militairement et d'avoir prétendument commis des actes contraires à ce que réclame la Convention des Nations Unies pour la prévention et la répression du génocide. Ceci est-il cause d'un différend? Comment pourrait-on en douter? L'Ukraine est en profond désaccord avec cette allégation qu'elle a toujours jugée totalement grotesque. Elle l'a fait savoir à la Russie à de multiples reprises, et dès septembre 2014. Dans un entretien rapporté par la BBC, le conseiller du ministre de l'Intérieur de l'Ukraine indiquait que le bureau du procureur général de l'Ukraine avait engagé des poursuites criminelles contre les agents du comité d'investigation de Russie, accusés par l'Ukraine d'assistance à une organisation terroriste dans le Donbass et d'obstruction à la mise en œuvre de la loi et au travail des agents de l'État, précisément parce qu'ils avaient lancé des accusations de génocide dans le Donbass contre l'Ukraine. Le conseiller ajoutait que, selon l'Ukraine, les accusations de génocide lancées par les suspects avaient pour seul objet de justifier l'occupation du Donbass. Je pourrais m'arrêter là, tant il est évident que lorsqu'un État accuse l'autre de violer la Convention sur le génocide et que l'autre engage des poursuites judiciaires contre les agents du premier au motif qu'ils profèrent de fausses allégations, un différend relatif à l'interprétation, l'application ou l'exécution de la Convention sur le génocide est indubitablement établi. Du reste, le rejet des accusations russes comme totalement infondées n'a pas été limité à l'Ukraine. On se souvient, car c'était il y a moins d'un mois, que le 16 février 2022, le département d'État américain avait dénoncé les accusations de génocide proférées par la Russie comme destinées à fabriquer de toutes pièces un prétexte à une invasion militaire de l'Ukraine. Quant au chancelier de l'Allemagne, il avait dénoncé l'accusation russe de génocide comme, je ne sais pas si on doit dire ridicule ou risible, laughable, déclenchant l'ire du ministre des Affaires étrangères de la Fédération de Russie. Pour sa part, l'Ukraine a encore marqué son désaccord avec la Russie par la voix de son ministre des Affaires étrangères. Le 23 février 2022, devant l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies, alors que l'ambassadeur de Russie à l'ONU, Vassili Niebienzia, justifiait la légalité de la reconnaissance russe de l'indépendance des oblasts de Donetsk et Louhansk en disant, je cite, et donc c'est sur la gauche de votre écran, étant donné le génocide flagrant et le piétinement du plus important des droits humains, le droit de vivre, notre pays ne peut rester indifférent au sort des 4 millions de personnes dans le Donbass. Génocide flagrant. Le ministre des Affaires étrangères de l'Ukraine, M. Kouliba, répondait, je cite, « Les accusations de la Russie à l'égard de l'Ukraine sont absurdes. L'Ukraine n'a jamais menacé ou attaqué qui que ce soit. L'Ukraine n'a jamais planifié, ne planifie pas une telle action. Les actions et les déclarations de la Russie sont scandaleuses, horribles et vont bien au-delà de la menace contre l'Ukraine. » En fait, dans son discours de cette semaine, le président russe Vladimir Poutine a ouvertement nié le droit à l'existence de l'Ukraine. Fin de citation. Le 26 février 2022, le ministère des Affaires étrangères de l'Ukraine réitérait avec force le rejet par l'Ukraine des accusations de violation de la Convention sur le génocide comme étant sans fondement. Je cite le communiqué qui est évidemment au dossier des juges, tab 26. L'Ukraine dément fermement les allégations de génocide de la Russie et rejette toute tentative d'utiliser ces allégations manipulatrices comme excuse pour une agression illégale. Le crime de génocide est défini par la Convention sur le génocide et, selon cette convention, les allégations de la Russie sont sans fondement et absurdes. Les allégations de génocide de la Russie, pour justifier sa conduite illégale, sont une insulte à la Convention sur le génocide et au travail de la communauté internationale pour prévenir et punir le crime le plus grave du monde. Fin de citation. Madame la Présidente, Mesdames et Messieurs les juges, ces faits parlent d'eux-mêmes. Ils attestent de l'existence, au moins prima facie, d'un différend entre les parties qui se résume ainsi. La Russie accuse l'Ukraine de s'être livrée à des actes et à une politique de génocide au sens de l'article 2 de la Convention. L'Ukraine lui rétorque que ces allégations sont absurdes et même odieuses, car elles sont l'évident habillage juridique d'une agression armée. Ce différend entre dans les prévisions de l'article 9 de la Convention.
Мирні народи воюючої країни. Ми захищаємось від вторгнення вже 12-й день. Ми ніколи не хотіли цієї війни, але її принесли до нас. Ми ніколи не мріяли вбивати, але нам доводиться вибивати ворога з нашої землі та з нашого життя. Нам доводиться терпіти те, чого жоден інший народ Європи не бачив 80 років. І саме на нашій землі вирішується, чи стане хтось інший в Європі жертвою такої ж агресії. Я говорю це лідерам світу і чую, що вони погоджуються. Майбутнє континенту вирішуємо ми своїм спротивом і наші друзі своєю допомогою. Знову говорив з президентом Польщі Анджеєм Дудою. Допомагають. Працюємо. Говорив з прем'єр-міністром Британії Борисом Джонсоном, головою італійського уряду Маріо Драгі, з президентом Франції Еммануелем Макроном і прем'єр-міністром Індії Моді. Отримав дуже важливі сигнали, які, я впевнений, тільки посилять Україну. Наші тези в розмовах з партнерами абсолютно логічні. Вони справедливі, чесні, Якщо вторгнення продовжується і Росія не відмовилась від своїх планів проти України, значить потрібен новий санкційний пакет. Нові санкції, нові санкційні кроки проти війни заради миру. Бойкот російського експорту. Зокрема, відмова від нафти і нафтопродуктів з Росії. Це можна називати ембарго, а можна просто мораллю. Коли відмовляєшся давати гроші терористу. Бойкот імпорту в Росії. Якщо не хочуть дотримуватись цивілізованих правил, то не мають отримувати і товарів та послуг від цивілізації. Хай війна їх нагодує. Міжнародна спільнота має діяти ще більш рішуче. Коли хтось втрачає розум, треба втратити страх і забути про комерцію. Треба захищатись, треба бути моральними і державам, і компаніям. Треба боротись проти нелюдської сили, яка хоче зруйнувати саму людяність. Успіх української армії, воля українського народу, принциповість міжнародних санкцій – ось шлях до миру. Вночі окупанти вдарили по Миколаєву, прямо по житловим районам, з реактивної артилерії, били по Харкову, спальні райони мирного міста, били по іншим містам нашої держави. Жодного воєнного сенсу. Просто терор. Тримають в заручниках мешканців Ірпеня, Бучі, Гостомеля, багатьох інших міст та містечок, селищ, які окупанту вдалося захопити тимчасово, поки не отримають покарання. А вони отримують. Наші Збройні сили знають, як це робити. Ворог втомлений, деморалізований. Вони прийшли на нашу землю шукати те, чого тут ніколи не було – боягузтво. Згоду на рабство. Будь-якій нормальній людині страшно дивитись на згорілі будинки, це зрозуміло. Зруйновані панельні багатоповерхівки, знищені звичайні машини, ракети, авіабомби, гради, міномети проти людей. Відчуття, ніби це в іншій країні. Але це в нашій країні. Саме в нашій, не десь там, в нашій, яка завжди хотіла миру більш за усе. Скільки ще потрібно смертей і втрат, щоб убезпечити небо над Україною? Чим мирні люди у Харкові чи Миколаєві відрізняються від Гамбургу або Відня? Ми чекаємо рішення, очищення неба, або силою, яка у вас є, або ви дасте нам бойові літаки і засоби протиповітряної оборони, які дадуть нам потрібну силу. Це допомога, яку світ повинен надати не просто Україні, а собі, щоб довести людяність переможе якнайшвидше. Уряд України вже працює над тим, як відновити нашу державу після перемоги, як дати більше сил країні, поки ми боремось. Створений спеціальний пакет допомоги бізнесу та працівникам. ФОПи першої і другої групи повністю звільняються від ЄСВ. Підприємства та ФОПи третьої групи звільняються від сплати ЄСВ за найманих працівників, які були призвані до лав Збройних сил України та інших захисних формувань, в тому числі тероборони. Звільнення від сплати податку на землю та орендної плати за землю державної і комунальної власності на всіх територіях, де ведуться бойові дії. Усе це на час воєнного стану та ще мінімум на рік після його завершення. Відтерміновується сплата податків для всіх підприємств, які не спроможні їх заплатити. І це тільки перша частина великого пакету допомоги, урядової підтримки. Усі керівники центральної влади мають чітке завдання розробити таку систему дій, щоб відновлення України було швидким та орієнтувалося тільки на людей, перш за все на них. На те, щоб ми всі повернулися до миру, до звичайної роботи, коли повернемо нашу землю, спокій на нашу землю. Я вдячний усім власникам і керівникам підприємств, які продовжують працювати і виконують зобов'язання перед своїми працівниками. Платити зарплату людям. Навіть якщо компанія не працює, як раніше, це значить захищати Україну. Держава всі свої зобов'язання виконує. Проіндексовані пенсії вже у людей. Зарплата в бюджетній сфері виплачується так, як це і має бути. Українці. Нас багато, нас мільйони. А це мільйони способів боротися за своє майбутнє. За нашу державу, за нашу свободу. За наш національний прапор. Жовто-блакитний, не триколор. Ми захищаємо наш прапор, бо це наш світогляд. Під жовто-блакитним ми перемагали на Олімпіадах. Цей прапор ми розгортали і в космосі, і в Антарктиді. Під нашим національним прапором наші рятівники, наші пожежники, миротворці, медики, всі інші приходили на допомогу Туреччині, Греції, Ізраїлю і Грузії, Афганістану, Чорногорії, Індії, Італії, Конго та багатьом іншим країнам світу. Чого ми ніколи не робили під цим прапором? Не нападали на інші країни, не захоплювали чужі землі, не вбивали людей, мирних людей інших народів. Ми і терор – це різні всесвіти. Тому на нашому прапорі немає крові, немає і ніколи не буде чорних плям, немає і ніколи не буде жодних свастик. Український прапор – це земля, мирна, родюча, золота, без танків. Це небо, мирне, чисте, блакитне, без ракет. Так було і так буде. Я вірю, я знаю. Слава Україні!
Russia would have the world believe that Ukraine launched a genocidal war on its own people in the Donbass. Even a basic understanding of the facts shows this to be false. In addressing the facts, 2 points should be stressed. First, the full history of Russia's mistreatment of Ukraine is not before the court. This case is about false claims of genocide in the war Russia launched to purportedly prevent and punish alleged acts of genocide. I will focus on only the background that will be most helpful to the court in appreciating the falsity of Russia's allegations. Second, in political forums, Russia presents a narrative based on forgeries, fakes, and distortions. In this legal forum, I will not present one country's narrative against another's. I will present the facts as documented by UN human rights bodies and officials and similarly credible, neutral observers. Madam President, in February 2014, the Ukrainian people rose up in a revolution of dignity. Russia responded with aggression, invading and occupying the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. Then, as now, Russia's aggression was based on lies. Russia first denied that it had used its military. Then, President Putin admitted it. Then he claimed without basis that, quote, the Russian-speaking population was threatened, end quote. The international community rejected Russia's actions, and the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 68262, overwhelmingly reaffirming the territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea. With Crimea occupied, Russia tried to apply the same tactics to the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, spanning the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. But Russia did not find support. So instead, it looked to illegal armed groups to advance its agenda. These groups called themselves the Donetsk People's Republic, or DPR, and the Luhansk People's Republic, or LPR. This is how the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine described the DPR and LPR in May of 2014, the earliest days of the conflict. The mission is concerned with the undermining of human rights protection and guarantees of fundamental freedoms for the population of the town where buildings are occupied by armed persons, as well as the broader population of eastern Ukraine. Specifically, the UN mission is concerned about the rise in the number of reported cases of intimidation, harassment, and killings, as well as the wave of abductions and unlawful detentions of journalists, activists, local politicians, representatives of international organizations, and members of the military. 1 month later, the UN Human Rights Mission reported as follows: violence and lawlessness have spread in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Having gained access to deposits of weapons, the armed groups increasingly started spreading violence. Increasingly, attacks target ordinary people who take no part in the fighting. And here's the UN Human Rights Mission 1 month after that, in July 2014. Grave human rights abuses have been committed by those armed groups. And it must be remembered that these groups have taken control of Ukrainian territory and inflicted on the populations a reign of intimidation and terror to maintain their position. Ukraine was therefore faced with illegal armed groups controlling territory, murdering civilians, and waging a campaign of terror. Any responsible government in this situation would work to restore law, order, and respect for human rights. And that is what Ukraine did. The early history of Ukraine's operation is documented, again, by the UN monitoring mission. It reports on Ukraine's efforts to limit the operation, calling an early stop to it in observance of Easter. But Ukraine was compelled to resume the operation, quote, following the discovery of the bodies with alleged signs of torture of Volodymyr Rybak, Horlivka city councillor, and Yuri Popravko, a student and Maidan activist from Kiev, in a river near Slovyansk on 19 April. This refers to a well-known incident discussed at the UN Security Council in which Mr. Rybak was kidnapped, tortured, and assassinated by the DPR for the crime of raising the Ukrainian flag. Ukraine resolved to secure its territory and protect its people. On their own, and without meaningful popular support, it is difficult to imagine the DPR and LPR maintaining any territory for long. But these illegal armed groups found eager sponsors in Russia. In December 2014, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission reported that, quote, the total breakdown in law and order and the violence of fighting in the eastern regions, end quote, was, quote, fueled by the cross-border inflow of heavy and sophisticated weaponry as well as foreign fighters, including from the Russian Federation, end quote. The ICC Office of the Prosecutor has likewise tied the increased intensity of fighting to influxes of troops, vehicles, and weaponry from the Russian Federation. Over time, Russia's influence and control and overt role in the conflict grew, and in 2018, Ukrainian legislation declared the Donbass occupied territory. Fueled by Russia, the carnage in eastern Ukraine grew. I will highlight only one example: the shelling of a residential district in Mariupol on 24 January 2015. 30 civilians died in the attack. According to the UN Secretary General, the attackers fired indiscriminately into civilian areas. The Undersecretary General for Political Affairs elaborated that they knowingly targeted a civilian population. I should add that Mariupol is a Russian-speaking city. Russia's claim to be the protectors of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine did not protect Mariupol from a barrage of Russian rockets in 2015, just as it is not protecting Mariupol today from a Russian siege army that is bombarding the city and cutting off its power, water, and heat. Madam President, members of the court, these are the circumstances in which Russia claims that Ukraine has been committing genocide against its own people. It would be an understatement to say that Russia has provided no evidence for acts of genocide in the course of this conflict. The closest President Putin has come to even explaining his allegation of genocide is to assert, as he did on 21 February of this year, that, quote, "Not a single day goes by without Donbass communities coming under shelling attacks," end quote. This is another flagrant lie for which Russia has offered no support. Shortly, Ms. Cheek will apply the definition of genocide under Article 2 of the Convention and show that no such acts have been committed. For now, I will make 3 factual points. First, Ukrainian civilians on both sides of the contact line have suffered from a conflict which Russia has funded and fueled and increasingly waged itself. Tragically, Ukraine's adversaries have had no regard to the lives of civilians on their side of the line. This is not Ukraine's position alone. It is a fact documented by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission. Quote, "The armed groups are locating their military assets in and conducting attacks from densely populated areas, thereby putting the whole civilian population at risk." The civilians on both sides of the line are Ukrainian, and Ukraine regards every civilian death in this conflict as a tragedy. But to claim that Ukraine targets civilians is to distort facts. As I noted a moment ago, in the course of this conflict, top UN officials condemned the DPR for knowingly targeting a residential area. You will not find anything that comes close to that about Ukraine. Second, if there were attacks on civilians rising to the level of genocide, allegedly warranting an armed invasion, one would think there must have been a massive recent escalation in civilian casualties, at the least. Yet that is transparently not the case. UN human rights monitors have tracked the year-over-year civilian casualties in the conflict. The UN statistics on your screen show a dramatic decrease. These figures, moreover, cover both sides and do not reflect any conclusion of civilians being targeted. To be clear, Ukraine regards as tragic each of the 15 deaths recorded as of the date of the most recent report in 2021. But Russia's claim that Ukraine is targeting civilians is a clear fabrication. Indeed, as recently as 22 December 2021, the OSCE announced a renewed ceasefire agreement. As further explained in a recent report by The Guardian, quote, "The OSCE logs regular firing between Moscow armed separatists and Ukrainian soldiers. In recent months, this low-level conflict has been relatively calm, as Russia has moved 150,000 troops to Ukraine's borders, and Ukrainian soldiers have been under instructions not to return fire," end quote. Third, if one point should be clear from my presentation, it is that UN human rights monitors have been meticulously tracking the conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk from its inception to the present. In 8 years of reporting, there is not a single hint of any act of genocide. The OSCE has logged every ceasefire violation, and you will not find in its reports any evidence of genocide. Ukraine has recognized the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, whose jurisdiction includes the crime of genocide. The Office of the Prosecutor has been examining the situation for 7 years and found evidence of crimes, but has never said a word about genocide. In short, Russia's claim is that a genocide has occurred under the noses of diligent UN fact-finders, OSCE monitors, and ICC prosecutors. It defies credulity. I turn finally to the present. For months, the world watched Russia mass its forces along Ukraine's borders. Yet as recently as 31 January 2022, at a meeting of the UN Security Council, the permanent representative of Russia reacted angrily to suggestions that Russia planned to invade. He mockingly called on the United States to, quote, "show us at least some evidence, apart from bogus narratives fabricated in their own heads, that Russia intends to attack Ukraine." That was a lie. Little more than 3 weeks later, Russia did attack Ukraine. The same permanent representative would justify his country's invasion based on claims of genocide. Another lie. To the end, Russia appeared desperate to manufacture a casus belli. But plans to stage false flag attacks were exposed. Shelling was intensified along the contact line to provoke retaliation, but Ukraine would not oblige. On 17 February, a horrific act of violence did occur in Luhansk Oblast when a kindergarten was attacked. The OSCE called this indiscriminate shelling. Yet the kindergarten was in government-controlled territory. As Human Rights Watch reported from the ground, the attack appeared to have been committed, quote, by Russia-backed armed groups, end quote. Russia thus found itself eager to invade Ukraine, but lacking any conceivable justification. So Russia settled on its lie. President Putin would dramatically trumpet his accusation of genocide. Russia would recognize the DPR and LPR as independent states on the basis of the genocide they allegedly faced. And Russia would invade Ukraine for the express purpose of protecting the people of Donbass from this fabricated genocide and to punish the supposed génocidaire. With the groundwork laid, the claim of genocide invoked, Russia proceeded to unleash the military aggression that is now horrifying the world. Madam President, members of the court, as we speak, Russian speakers in Ukraine are indeed under attack. Ukrainians are under attack regardless of what language they speak. They are under attack from Russia. Médecins Sans Frontières reported 2 days ago that, quote, the humanitarian situation in Mariupol is catastrophic, end quote. The predominantly Russian-speaking city of Kharkiv is under barbaric attack, with cluster munitions being launched indiscriminately at residential areas. According to a UN report, in the first 6 days of Russia's war, there were nearly as many civilian casualties as in the last 5 years of the Donbas conflict. And that is just confirmed casualties, with the UN recognizing that the real number is much higher and climbing every day. Yet Russia has the gall to massacre Ukrainians and call it protection. Russia has the gall to attempt to overthrow a democratically elected government and call it punishment of Nazis. Russia has the gall to accuse Ukraine of a fake genocide and to rain very real destruction and terror on the 44 million inhabitants of a sovereign state. Madam President, the facts are undeniable. Russia's allegations of genocide are false and outrageous. I respectfully ask that you call on Ms. Marnichik, who will explain the plausibility of the rights Ukraine asserts under the Genocide Convention.
I thank Mr. Zients, and I now invite Ms. Marnichik to take the floor. You have the floor, Ms. Cheek.
Madam President, distinguished members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you again on behalf of Ukraine. I will discuss the rights that Ukraine seeks to preserve through its request for provisional measures. As stated in this court's order on provisional measures in the Gambia versus Myanmar, and here I substitute Ukraine for the Gambia, quote, at this stage of the proceedings, the court is not called upon to determine definitively whether the rights which Ukraine wishes to see protected exist. It need only decide whether the rights claimed by Ukraine on the merits and for which it is seeking protection are plausible. In this case, the rights asserted by Ukraine are plausible, as they are, to again quote the court in Belgium v. Senegal, grounded in a possible interpretation of the Convention. Indeed, the rights that Ukraine asserts are grounded in a good faith interpretation of the Convention, while Russia's use of the Genocide Convention to try to mask its unlawful invasion of Ukraine can only be described as proceeding in bad faith in violation of the Convention. This morning, I will first describe the rights and obligations that exist under the Genocide Convention. Second, I will explain that there is no plausible evidence of genocide in the Donbas region of Ukraine. Third, and finally, I will elaborate on Ukraine's right to demand good faith performance and to not be subjected to abuse or misuse of the Genocide Convention. So let me first describe generally the rights and obligations under the Genocide Convention. Article 1 of the Genocide Convention confirms that genocide is a crime under international law, which the contracting parties, quote, undertake to prevent and punish. This court has interpreted Article 1, observing in the Bosnia genocide case that while the Genocide Convention, quote, does not expressis verbis require states to refrain from themselves committing genocide, that is precisely what the duty to prevent genocide necessarily implies. The court went on to further explain the obligation to prevent genocide as follows, quote, a state's obligation to prevent and the corresponding duty to act arise at the instant that the state learns of, or should normally have learned of, the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. From that moment onwards, if the state has available to it means likely to have a deterrent effect, or those suspected of preparing genocide, or reasonably suspected of harboring specific intent, dolus specialis, it is under a duty to make such use of these means as the circumstances permit. Thus, consistent with the object and purpose of the Genocide Convention, to liberate mankind from the odious scourge of genocide, Article 1 includes both an obligation not to commit genocide, as well as a duty to act to prevent and punish genocide. With regard to the duty to act, where there is a serious risk of genocide, states should take preventative measures likely to have a deterrent effect. Further, under Article 4 of the Convention, quote, persons committing genocide or any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3 shall be punished, whether they are constitutionally responsible leaders, public officials, or private individuals. Russia has acted inconsistently with these obligations and duties. It has fabricated a claim of genocide in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. It has then justified its military invasion of the entire country as the prevention of that fabricated genocide and as punishment of the alleged perpetrators of genocide through so-called denazification. It has not taken preventive measures likely to have a deterrent effect. As this court explained in its 1951 advisory opinion on the reservations to the Convention on Genocide, the Convention was manifestly adopted for a purely humanitarian and civilizing purpose. It is indeed difficult to imagine a convention that might have this dual character to a greater degree, since its object, on the one hand, is to safeguard the very existence of certain human groups, and on the other, to confirm and endorse the most elementary principles of morality. In such a convention, the contracting states do not have any interests of their own. They merely have one and all a common interest, namely the accomplishment of those high purposes which are the raison d'etre of the Convention. Consequently, in a convention of this type, one cannot speak to individual advantages or disadvantages to states or to the maintenance of a perfect contractual balance between rights and duties. The high ideals which inspired the Convention provide, by virtue of the common will of the parties, the foundation and measure of all of its provisions. The Russian Federation has flouted these ideals. It does not act with high purposes. It does not act with common interest with the other parties to the convention. Instead, Russia has invoked the rights and duties recognized by the convention in bad faith. It has abused and misused them, unilaterally invoking genocide as a legal shield for its unlawful aggression against Ukraine. As Ukraine's cities are destroyed and its people killed in the name of preventing and punishing genocide, the Convention's humanitarian and civilizing purpose is being turned inside out. The object and purpose of the Convention is being defeated. Let me now explain, for the avoidance of doubt, that there is no plausible genocide in the Donbas region of Ukraine. The duty to prevent and punish genocide only arises when there is an actual genocide or a serious risk of it. Contrary to Russia's claims, there is no genocide or serious risk of it in the Donbas region. Genocide is defined in Article 2 of the treaty as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, including killings, causing serious bodily injury or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. There is simply no plausible evidence that Ukraine perpetrated such acts in the Donbas region of Ukraine or anywhere else. There is certainly no plausible evidence of the required dolus specialis, or specific intent, which this court has explained sets a high bar for proving the extraordinarily serious allegation of genocide. As Mr. Zients explained, there has been fighting in eastern Ukraine for the last 8 years. This has tragically led to civilian deaths. But civilian deaths in an armed conflict are not per se genocide. First of all, the requisite actus reus must be satisfied. In Croatian genocide, your court explained, quote, if one takes the view that the attacks were exclusively directed at military targets and that the civilian casualties were not caused deliberately, one cannot consider those attacks, inasmuch as they caused civilian deaths, as falling within the scope of Article 2A of the Genocide Convention. That is the situation in Donetsk and Luhansk, at least as regard to the actions of Ukraine. There is no plausible evidence that the civilian casualties in the Donbas region were caused deliberately by Ukraine. There is thus no plausible evidence that Ukraine committed killings within the meaning of Article 2. Nor is there any plausible evidence that Ukraine committed any of the various other Article 2 acts against civilians in the Donbas region. Without satisfying the actus reus under Article 2, there is no genocide under the Convention. But it is worth mentioning that there is also no evidence of the required mens rea of genocide. No evidence that Ukraine acted with the specific intent of destroying a particular national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Russia has seemed to suggest that its invasion is to liberate the Russian speakers in the Donbas region. But there are many cities in Ukraine, including in the Donbas region, that are predominantly Russian-speaking, yet do not welcome Russia's actions. To give just one example, Mariupol, a major port city in southeastern Ukraine, it is predominantly Russian-speaking. Yet there are no signs of Ukrainian human rights violations in Mariupol. Today, Mariupol is suffering a humanitarian crisis inflicted upon it by the Russian military, which will not allow safe passage for civilians as the Ukrainian government seeks to protect its citizens there. Quite simply, Russia's sweeping claim of a genocide, which almost 4 million people are facing, has no plausible basis in fact.
Ms. Cheek, may I kindly interrupt you before you begin the next section of your presentation, as it appears that this would be a good time for a coffee break of 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Sitting is adjourned. Please be seated. The sitting is resumed, and I shall now give the floor back to Ms. Cheek to continue with her presentation. You have the floor.
Madam President, members of the Court, I will now elaborate on Ukraine's right to demand good faith performance of the Genocide Convention and to not be subject to an abuse or misuse of the Genocide Convention. Without a plausible predicate act of genocide or a serious risk of it, Russia has no duty to prevent or punish under the Genocide Convention. Indeed, in order to act consistently with the object and purpose of the Convention, Russia has a duty not to act in the name of preventing and punishing genocide, since no genocide exists. Simply alleging genocide cannot give a state a right under the Convention to carry out a unilateral military operation against another state in order to prevent and punish the alleged genocide. As held by your court in military and paramilitary activities in and against Nicaragua, quote, where human rights are protected by international conventions, that protection takes the form of such arrangements for monitoring or ensuring respect for human rights as are provided for in the conventions themselves. In any event, while the United States might form its own appraisal of the situation as to respect for human rights in Nicaragua, the use of force could not be the appropriate method to monitor or ensure such respect. Ukraine has a right to demand good faith performance of the Genocide Convention consistent with the Convention's object and purpose. Article 26 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties sets forth the well-established principle of pacta sunt servanda, quote, every treaty in force is binding upon the parties to it and must be performed by them in good faith. The International Law Commission's commentaries on the draft articles that became the Vienna Convention explain that when drafting Article 26, quote, some members felt that there would be advantage in also stating that a party must abstain from acts calculated to frustrate the object and purpose of the treaty. The Commission, however, considered that this was clearly implicit in the obligation to perform the treaty in good faith and preferred to state the pacta sunt servanda rule in as simple a form as possible. Ukraine stands before you today because Russia has violated the principle of pacta sunt servanda in the performance of its rights and obligations under the Genocide Convention. the Russian Federation has not implemented or fulfilled its obligations under the Genocide Convention in good faith. Rather, it has used a baseless accusation of genocide to justify a so-called special military operation in Ukraine commenced on the 24th of February, 2022. This conduct by the Russian Federation turns the Genocide Convention on its head. Asserting a right to commit aggression under the guise of a duty to prevent and punish a non-existent genocide is not good faith performance of Articles 1 and 4 of the Genocide Convention. Indeed, it is an abuse of the rights granted through the Convention by each state party to all other state parties. Russia has taken a fundamental peremptory norm of international law, codified in one of the most important human rights treaties that emerged from World War II, and turned it into a charade. The conclusion that Russia's actions violate the treaty gained further support from the decision of your predecessor court in the case of certain German interests in Polish Upper Silesia. There, the court recognized that the misuse of a right was an act, quote, with the character of a breach of the treaty. Here, Russia is misusing its right, or in this case, misusing its duty to prevent and punish genocide. Russia's abuse of its obligations under the Genocide Convention has the character of a breach of the Convention. In the Gambia v. Myanmar, your court decided that the Gambia could invoke the responsibility of Myanmar under the Genocide Convention, concluding that all states have a common legal interest in the protection of rights under the Convention. Your court specifically referred to, quote, the right of any state party to seek compliance with the Convention by another state party. The contracting parties also have a common legal interest in ensuring that actions taken to implement Articles 1 and 4 of the Convention are taken in good faith, without abuse or misuse, consistent with the Genocide Convention's object and purpose. Otherwise, the Genocide Convention would lose the humanitarian character that this court has said is at the core of the treaty. Instead, the Genocide Convention could become a cynical tool enabling violations of sovereignty and human rights. Every contracting party has a right and interest in not seeing the Genocide Convention devalued in this manner. But today, Ukraine stands before you as not just another contracting party to the Convention, but as a party suffering direct harm as a result of Russia's abuse of its rights and duties under the Convention. Ukraine has a right not to suffer grave harm at the hands of a contracting party that disregards the object and purpose of the Convention by falsely cloaking a military invasion as an operation to prevent and punish genocide. As the court recalled on Gabčíkovo Nožimaros, the principle of pacta sunt servanda, as reflected in Article 26 of the Vienna Convention, quote, combines two elements which are of equal importance. It provides that every treaty in force is binding upon the parties to it, and it must be performed by them in good faith. This latter element, in the court's view, implies, in this case, it is the purpose of the treaty and the intentions of the parties in concluding it which should prevail over its literal application. the principle of good faith obliges the parties to apply it in a reasonable way and in such a manner that its purpose can be realized. Applying the principle of good faith performance to this case, a contracting party to the Genocide Convention must abstain from acts that frustrate the object and purpose of the treaty. Certainly, unilateral military action against Ukraine in reliance on a fake allegation of genocide is inconsistent with the treaty's object and purpose. This is apparent if one looks to the preamble of the treaty. Instead of international cooperation, there is unilateral action. Instead of working to liberate mankind from genocide, there are Russian attacks on civilian apartment buildings, schools, and power plants. Instead of reflecting on genocide as having inflicted great losses on humanity, Russia wields the word genocide as a sword to inflict great losses on the people of Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Mariupol, Kherson, Hostomel, Volnovakha, and many others. Quite simply, Russia has not performed its solemn right and duty to prevent and punish genocide in good faith. To the contrary, it has abused its treaty rights to inflict great loss on the people of Ukraine. It is a violation of the Convention for the Russian Federation to act to prevent a genocide that does not exist. It is a violation of the Convention for the Russian Federation to carry out a military action against Ukraine to punish it for a non-existent genocide. Ukraine has a right under the Convention not to suffer from Russia's misuse and abuse of the treaty. Specifically, Ukraine has a right under the Convention not to suffer aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity undertaken by the Russian Federation in order to prevent and punish a non-existent genocide. Certainly, in light of the Convention's object and purpose, and the Russian Federation's obligation to perform the treaty in good faith, Ukraine's rights are at least plausible and grounded in a possible interpretation of the Convention, which is all that the Court must find at this stage for provisional measures to be appropriate. If Russia had performed its obligations under the Convention in good faith and done its due diligence to assess whether a genocide or serious risk of genocide actually existed in concreto, Russia would have found no basis to act. As this court observed in Bosnian genocide, quote, "The notion of due diligence is of critical importance." This due diligence was not undertaken. Instead, on the 24th of February 2022, a mere 11 days ago, President Putin announced a so-called special military operation and stated that, quote, "The purpose of this operation is to protect people who, for 8 years now, have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime." On that same day, the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations stated in an emergency session of the UN Security Council that, quote, "The goal of this special operation is protection of people who have been victimized and exposed to genocide by the Kiev regime." The next day, Russia's ambassador to the European Union justified the invasion by saying, quote, "We can turn to the official term genocide as coined in international law." And of course, as we know, it is the Genocide Convention that defines genocide under international law. As Professor Tuvenan noted, the Russian Investigative Committee has for years claimed that, quote, that the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide has been systematically violated in eastern Ukraine. In November 2021, as yet another example, the Russian ambassador to the Contact Group for Eastern Ukraine, Boris Gryzlov, described certain actions taken by the President of Russia as, quote, a forced response to the actions of Kiev, which are aimed at escalating the conflict and actually fall under the United Nations Convention on the Prevention of Genocide. Russia has now acted on this fundamentally flawed legal basis, brandishing the language of human rights and claiming a duty to prevent and punish genocide grounded in the Convention. The world is watching a military invasion that Russia launched under the guise of a duty to protect the Ukrainians of the Donbas region from genocide. It was launched to purportedly punish the alleged perpetrators of Kiev, who are implausibly accused of being Nazis. There is a sad and tragic irony here, as Russia's abuse and misuse of the Genocide Convention and Russia's failure to perform its obligations under the Convention in good faith has led to a very real human rights tragedy, as my colleague Mr. Gimblett will explain in greater detail. Under the pretext of acting to prevent and punish genocide in eastern Ukraine, the Russian Federation has sent tens of thousands of troops across Ukraine's northern border with Belarus. Bombs have rained down on the city of Chernihiv in the north. Russian troops are approaching Odessa from the Black Sea in the south. Bombs are raining down on the capital of Kiev in central Ukraine. Russia's military onslaught is in no way limited to eastern Ukraine and belies its justification for its actions. Your court explained in Bosnia genocide, quote, it would be paradoxical if states were thus under an obligation to prevent, so far as within their power, commission of genocide by persons over whom they have a certain influence, but were not forbidden to commit such acts through their own organs. In short, the obligation to prevent genocide necessarily implies the prohibition on the commission of genocide. The case before you presents a further paradox. It is paradoxical for a state to invoke a breach of the Genocide Convention as a justification for military invasion, to punish Ukraine, its democratically elected leaders, and its people, despite the fact that there is no plausible evidence of genocide at all. I believe Mr. Zion said that Russia lies. Professor Tuvenan pointed to Russia's complete disregard for international law, and both of those statements are true. And when Russia acts to prevent and punish genocide without basis, it offends the humanitarian principles enshrined in the Genocide Convention. The text of Article 1 of the Genocide Convention speaks of the duty to protect and punish. Other provisions of the Genocide Convention give further content to the scope of that duty. Article 4, as previously mentioned, focuses on the punishment of those who commit genocide. Article 5 points to legislation to provide effective penalties for those found guilty of genocide. Article 6 speaks to the prosecution of those accused of committing genocide, and Article 7 speaks of extradition. Article 8 states that a contracting party, quote, may call upon the competent organs of the United Nations to take such action under the Charter of the United Nations for the prevention and suppression of acts of genocide. But Russia is not focused on any of these things. Instead, it has chosen to wage a war. As the court recognized in the Bosnia genocide case with regard to the duty to prevent genocide under the convention, quote, "It is clear that every state may only act within the limits permitted by international law. In this regard, Article 8 of the Convention provides useful context regarding the limits on the duty to prevent and punish under Article 1. Article 8 expressly refers to the UN Charter and appropriate actions for the prevention and suppression of acts of genocide. Article 8 thereby anchors the duty to prevent and punish genocide in the principles of international law reflected in the UN Charter. Madam President, members of the court, Russia's military action against Ukraine based on a manifestly false claim of genocide is inconsistent with the Genocide Convention and exceeds the limits permitted by international law. After you hear about the urgency of the situation and irreparable harm from my colleague, Mr. Jonathan Gimblett, Professor Harold Hanju Ko will address the provisional measures requested by Ukraine, including their link to these rights Ukraine seeks to preserve until the merits of the case can be decided. Madam President, I would now ask you to call upon Mr. Jonathan Gimblett. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement, Ms. Cheek. I now give the floor to Mr. Jonathan Gimblett. You have the floor, sir.
Madam President, distinguished members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you today on behalf of Ukraine. I will explain why the conditions of irreparable harm and urgency are amply satisfied in the circumstances of this case and require the indication of provisional measures with the minimum delay possible. The court has repeatedly interpreted its power to indicate provisional measures as arising when irreparable prejudice could be caused to rights which are the subject of judicial proceedings, or when the alleged disregard of such rights may entail irreparable consequences. The court has also frequently stated that it will exercise that power only if there is urgency, in the sense that there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused to the rights claimed before the court gives its final decision. In assessing whether this condition is satisfied, the court looks at a variety of factors depending on the facts of the case. For example, in cases involving ongoing conflict, the court typically considers whether the population at risk is particularly vulnerable. Other relevant factors are the fragility of the overall situation, including the likelihood of aggravation of the dispute, and the risk of recurrence of harm. All of these factors point unambiguously to the existence of an urgent situation in Ukraine requiring provisional measures. As Ms. Cheek has explained, Ukraine has a right not to suffer detriment as a result of the bad faith implementation of the Genocide Convention by another contracting party. Since the 24th of February 2022, the Russian Federation has been engaged in widespread military operations on Ukrainian territory based on its false allegation of an ongoing genocide in Donbass, which it says requires that it intervenes to protect the population of that region. As I will explain next, those military operations have triggered a military, humanitarian, an environmental crisis of a like not seen in Europe since 1945. I will conclude by showing that all of the factors indicating urgency that I outlined earlier are engaged in this crisis. Anyone who has watched the television news outside Russia in the past 11 days knows that President Putin's so-called special military operation for the purpose of preventing genocide is far from the surgical, limited action implied by that euphemism. In reality, Russia has been engaged in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, attacking simultaneously from the north, the east, and the south, with the objective of capturing the major population centres. It is equally obvious that this invasion has caused, is causing, and will continue to cause huge human suffering, including through the widespread commission of war crimes, the displacement of literally millions of civilians, and the privations imposed on many millions more who are trapped in cities facing savage and indiscriminate bombardment by the Russian armed forces. After describing those human impacts, I will speak briefly about the catastrophic and environmental consequences of Russia's actions. It has been obvious since the earliest days of Russia's invasion that war crimes are being committed. As early as the 28th of February, 4 days into the operation, the ICC prosecutor announced that he was seeking authorization to open an investigation into Russia's conduct, while noting that a referral from an ICC state party would allow his team to get to work immediately. Referrals from a record 39 states parties were promptly received, allowing the investigation to be formally opened 2 days later on the 2nd of March. As the Prosecutor General of Ukraine explained in a communication to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court on the 28th of February, which you will find at tab 50 in your folder, these crimes include willful killing of civilians, like the civilian shot in the head by a Russian soldier when he started filming a column of military vehicles on his mobile phone. Intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects, such as the civilian bus that was fired upon by Russian forces near the village of Veloki Yar in Kharkiv region on the 26th of February, killing the driver and 2 passengers and injuring 18 more. Attacking or bombarding towns, villages, dwellings or buildings that are undefended non-military objectives. For example, the attack on Kharkiv Regional Clinical Children's Hospital No. 1 on the 25th of February, which was left without electricity after being hit 20 times by Russian shells, forcing staff to ventilate numerous vulnerable patients manually. And intentionally directing attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, as well as against places where the sick and the wounded are collected, such as the shelling of an ambulance transporting a wounded Ukrainian serviceman in Kherson region on the 26th of February. All of these acts, documented by the Prosecutor General, are expressly prohibited by the Rome Statute. They all occurred in the opening days of Russia's so-called special military operation, before Russian forces had closed in on densely populated civilian areas. Similar war crimes from this initial period of the conflict have also been reported by NGOs active in the field, including New Direction, whose report you will find at tab 51 of your folder. I'm afraid, though, that much, much worse has happened since these incidents and is yet to come. Having failed to secure their military objectives in the first week of their invasion, Russia today is resorting to tactics reminiscent of medieval siege warfare, encircling cities, cutting off escape routes, and pounding the civilian population with heavy ordnance. Today, that is the fate of Mariupol, as reflected in this photograph. According to the town council there, the situation is dire. Mariupol continues to live without electricity, water, and heating due to constant shelling by the Russian occupiers. Twice in the last 2 days, Russia has agreed to open a humanitarian corridor out of Mariupol, only to resume shelling so that civilians could not use it. Today, Mariupol. Tomorrow, or the day after, it may be the turn of Kharkiv and Kiev. These next two photographs, for example, show the damage already inflicted by Russian artillery on residential apartments in Kharkiv and in Borodyanka, a town on the approach road to the Ukrainian capital. The inevitability of further war crimes, if this carnage continues, is guaranteed by the indiscriminate nature of the weapons Russia is already using and others it has deployed to the battlefield, but whose use has not yet been confirmed. Grad multi-launch rocket systems have been implicated in numerous attacks on civilian targets across Ukraine. The use of cluster bombs by Russian forces has also been reliably documented. Perhaps equally concerning, though, as the use of these barbaric weapons, is the fact that Russia is reported to have deployed its TOS-1 platform to Ukraine. The thermobaric rockets fired by this platform, also known as vacuum bombs, literally suck the oxygen out of the air to produce a longer blast wave than conventional bombs. Inevitably, this level of violence unleashed by the Russian Federation has created a massive humanitarian crisis. As Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, reported to the Human Rights Council on the 3rd of March, over 2 million people have been forced to flee their homes. 1 million, according to UNHCR estimates, are internally displaced. A further 1,040,000 refugees have sought safety in neighbouring countries in the past 7 days, often after travelling for days by bicycle or on foot in freezing conditions. UNHCR has estimated that up to 4 million people could leave the country in the coming weeks if the conflict continues. The scale and speed of this refugee crisis is unprecedented in recent European history. As the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, said in a statement the same day, the 3rd of March, in just 7 days, 1 million people have fled Ukraine, uprooted by this senseless war. I have worked in refugee emergencies for almost 40 years, and rarely have I seen an exodus as rapid as this one. Indeed, so fast-moving is this crisis that by the 5th of March, just 2 days later, the UNHCR website was recording that more than 1.5 million Ukrainians had sought refuge in neighbouring countries. These raw statistics do not tell the full story of human misery involved in the refugee crisis, with families separated and homes abandoned, perhaps never to be seen again. The TV footage of fathers waving goodbye to their wives and children after putting them on packed trains to Western Ukraine, while they stay behind to fight the Russian army, is nothing less than heartrending. But the impact on internally displaced people, though massive, is only part of the story. Less visible, but potentially far more deadly, is the humanitarian crisis now developing in the numerous Ukrainian towns and cities ringed by Russian forces. For this much larger number, the present is grim, exposed to the indiscriminate firepower of Russian artillery, with food running short, and in some cases, water and electricity turned off by their assailants. A glimpse of the misery suffered by this group is provided by this photograph of children sheltering under a now destroyed traffic flyover from the shelling in Irpin, Kiev region. We will all have seen the television footage last night of people scrambling to get out of Irpin, with civilians losing their lives to Russian shells in the process. Bad as things are today, however, they can only get worse with every day that the Russian military campaign continues. As if all this human suffering was not enough, Russia's military action also poses grave environmental risks, not only to Ukraine, but also for the wider region. This is especially relevant given the court's statement in its advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, that the obligation on states to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not adversely affect the environment of other states applies in the context of armed conflict. A full-scale military invasion like that we are witnessing today involves countless environmental harms, many irreversible, a full description of which would fill a library. In the interest of time, I will mention two only. First, the world has witnessed with growing unease the Russian armed forces' recklessness with regards to the impact of its actions on Ukraine's civil nuclear industry. In the opening days of the invasion, Russian vehicles swept into the Chernobyl protected zone, tearing up radioactive soil and increasing the background level of radiation in the area 20-fold. Fortunately, the new safe confinement structure, which you can see in this image, completed in 2016 to seal off the remains of Chernobyl's damaged reactor number 4, appears not to have been damaged in Russia's military operation to date. Concerns over Russia's disregard for nuclear safety reached new highs in the early hours of the 4th of March, when Russian forces shelled the nuclear power station at Zaporizhzhia, the largest nuclear facility in Europe. You'll find at tab 55 in your folder a statement of the 4th of March by IAEA Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi, reflecting the seriousness of the situation that morning. Again, the world was fortunate that the resulting damage affected only a training facility and none of the 6 reactors located nearby. These were near misses, to be sure. In both cases, Russia's military aggression could have resulted in a new nuclear catastrophe affecting not only Ukraine or Russia, but potentially a vast surrounding area. And with the IAEA now expressing